Let's start off with, I mean, you know, as we mentioned, in June 2007, we had the National Credit Act implemented, and it became far more difficult to get credit out there. We've subsequently had a credit crisis. We've still got very high unemployment. We're looking at debt to disposable income ratios still remaining relatively high, sitting at around 79% or so. So the scenario in South Africa hasn't changed very much, or has it?
No, I mean, we're still worried about consumers, and as you say, the debt income ratio is still very high, and we're seeing that a lot of people struggling. And I think that is also what's reflected in the market when, you know, when the banks are not granting the bonds. It's because they see the number of consumers who are struggling to pay those existing bonds.
And this is in an environment where we still have subdued interest rates. In fact, 30-year low on the interest rates. And we were chatting a little earlier to Reana, you know, at the previous interview, and she was saying that banks need to come to the party and lend more. Do you think that they're being prudent, and perhaps we need to start looking at what is happening on the ground with many South Africans?
Yes, I think, you know, those are very, you know, intricate and complicated factors which they have to take into account. So, you know, far be it for me to say that, you know, they should lend more. When we, on the other end, you know, on the end where we're working, we see the consumers who cannot pay, and there are many thousands of them who simply cannot afford to repay their bonds and their cars.
Because that's when it really becomes difficult.
Correct.
And when you need to go for debt counselling, because your biggest expense on a monthly basis should be your bond.
Correct. And, you know, that is what the National Credit Act was designed to protect, because everybody, you know, from a social point of view, you want to try and keep people in their, you know, primary homes.
Also, just taking a look at what it means to go into debt counselling. What exactly does it mean for the average South African?
If you go into debt counselling, you've got protection. And the protection you have is that, you know, previously if you just cannot pay your monthly installment, the credit providers were entitled to take legal action. If you go for formal debt counselling, if you go and see a debt counsellor and they put you under the debt counselling program, then you've got protection from legal action. Summonses won't be issued, you won't get a judgment against your name. And then you form part of this process, and they will then guide you through how you must pay, what you must pay, and it's based on affordability. So yes, your payments may be less, you know, to sort of deal with what you can afford now, but you will also realize that then you'll pay for a longer period. But it is to try and assist those consumers who simply, they've maybe lost income, lost commission, one person, you know, in the household lost a job. So they want to pay, they don't want to lose their assets, but they cannot afford the full installments.
Is it an industry that is very well regulated and that runs as smoothly as you just alluded to?
It is regulated, at least, you know, so we've got the National Credit Regulator. The debt counsellors have to go for training, and they are registered. And if, of course, they don't play according to the rules, they can be deregistered, investigated. So yes, it is regulated. Unfortunately, not you know, everybody who's registered in the last 3 years and put themselves out there as debt counsellors were operating correctly or honestly. And that is where we come in. If the consumer, he's gone for debt counselling, he's given all his financial, you know, sort of troubles to this debt counsellor to sort out, and the debt counsellor runs away, doesn't answer his phone calls, or does something wrong, maybe takes money that he shouldn't, then previously the consumer would have had to go to the National Credit Regulator, and that's a long investigation process. We can also intervene to try and assist that
because
consumer.
there are other organisations as well, the National Debt Mediation Association, Debt Counsellors Association of South Africa as well. At what point do you then come in, the Credit Ombud?
As the Ombud, we're sort of the last port of call. So if a consumer phones in and say they've got a problem around debt counselling, whether it's with the credit providers in the debt counselling space who are not playing ball, or with the debt counsellor himself, or just with the whole process, we will advise them to try and first resolve it with, of course, the debt counsellor. If they can't, there are 3 other organisations, as you just said, that can also do an investigation, and they do mediation. But if that doesn't work, then we are there, and the credit industry are our members, and then of course we can try and resolve the dispute, because by that time there's clearly a dispute that needs a resolution.
One of the things that South Africa has perhaps you know, been under the spotlight for, and for positive reasons, is the fact that we are so prudent when it comes to credit, and given the fact that the NCA was implemented just before the crisis, and that we have created these mechanisms to assist homeowners. Give us an indication of whether things have gotten better in the last few years, or do you think that they've deteriorated prior to the NCA being implemented?
Look, I think, a lot of credit was granted prior to the NCA. And unfortunately, a lot of those people are the ones who then had to go for debt counselling or are struggling to pay because they took credit that they actually couldn't afford. But then, of course, there are other factors like people losing jobs because of the credit crunch. And there's the social problems like divorce or death in the family. Those things, it will always be there. So I think the credit, the drive to push credit just before the National Credit Act definitely contributed. And then, of course, after the Credit Act, there was a reluctance to just grant credit indiscriminately.
Well, Reana, if we could just head into some of the nitty-gritties as well when you go for debt counselling. What is the least that you can pay on a bond when, without the bank saying, well, this is not good enough for us?
There's not a fixed percentage. Obviously, it will depend on your income and your expenses, and every single item is looked at in some detail. So say, for example, you can only offer 30% of your monthly restallment now. The banks won't be happy with that, but if you, for example, tie that in with an offer to increase it when a payment or some investment comes loose, or if you're going to sell the property, they may well say, well, for a period, we'll accept this low installment. But those things are negotiated between your debt counsellor and the credit provider. So there's not a fixed amount. They'll look at every single consumer in his circumstances. And if, of course, they are happy with the offer, they will accept it and there's an agreement. If they are not happy with the offer and they feel that this is unreasonable and they simply cannot, sort of take such a low offer, then the case will go to the magistrate's court and the magistrate will make the final finding.